academic, think tank, broad sense of what is happening with Russia. And as you look at all of those challenges, realistically, how vulnerable is President Putin?
Well, thank you so much, Jill. It's wonderful to see you as well. And I'm just delighted that we're able to host this conversation. A new thing we're doing at CIPA is the interpretation. So I hope that those of you who are maybe listening in Russian are able to take part in the discussion as well. To go to your question, Jill, the reason we want to have this discussion is exactly because it very much seems to me that President Putin is incredibly vulnerable at this moment, which is perhaps a bit ironic to say, given that the Russian government did just push through these so-called constitutional amendments that de facto allow him to stay in power at least through the 2030s and probably beyond. So it seems initially that his power is quite set, that has been solidified, certainly in Russia domestically. But then if we pan out just a little bit beyond these constitutional reforms, we see that we've had ongoing protests for months in Russia's east, in Khabarovsk, of course. These protests have turned quite political. We have the ongoing protests against Lukashenko in Belarus. Of course, Russia has seen Belarus as very much part of its legitimate so-called sphere of influence, part of its neighborhood. And by losing Ukraine, they can't really afford to lose Belarus now as well. So in some ways, Moscow is fighting a war against authoritarianism and for democracy on both fronts, to its west and to its east. And on top of all that, the global pandemic has affected Russia in profound ways. The Russian economy wasn't doing well already, and certainly the pandemic is making them much worse. Putin's approval ratings have been dropping serendipitously for the last few months, and that's certainly not, I think, something the Kremlin is very happy about. So it's very hard to see a way out of a situation for him when there's so many factors pulling on his own legitimacy, the approval ratings. They're probably opening opportunities for others to ask questions whether he is the so-called, efficient manager that the Kremlin propaganda has made him out to be, or whether when he's really hit with a real crisis that's affecting people's livelihoods, and people speak out against the kind of authoritarianism we've seen in Russia, whether they can really handle it. And I will not speak, I think we'll get to it, of course, on the horrendous act attributed to the Russian government of the poisoning of Russia's main opposition leader, Alexei Navalny. And that, I think, is creating an ongoing and developing diplomatic problem for the Kremlin as well, to say the least. But I think we'll get to talk about the implications of that as we go on.
Mm-hmm. Let me just follow up quickly, because, this idea that President Putin eventually will have to go, maybe sooner than later, has been around for quite a long time, albeit right now we have this enormous, perfect storm. But one of the ideas that some have proposed is that even if Putin goes, the Putin system continues. How do you answer that? What do you think?
Yeah, the sistema, of course, which refers to this notion that it's not just about sort of the snake's head; it's the whole snake that's really the problem. And certainly, I think in Russia, given the 20 years now that we've seen of Putinism as a system has come into place in a profound way. But I think you can be pessimistic about it and say, well, no matter who's at the top of government in Russia, things will always stay the same. I think if you look at Ukraine, if you look at other former Soviet states, you see that's not really true. The things can change. It takes longer than we'd like, but things do change. And I think things can and will change in Russia eventually, because the current system is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the Russian people, and it's not sustainable economically as well. So yes, of course, there's that legacy that is deeply embedded. There's a legacy of corruption. on which the regime maintains its current hold on power. But these things are not inevitable. It's not inevitable that just because that's the way it is today, this is the way it will always be.
Okay, thank you. President Ilves, I'd like to ask you, again, good to see you again. You have had really a unique vantage point. You've been able, when you were president of Estonia, which of course has a very direct relationship with Russia anyway, but you as president really, met Putin, observed him directly. There were, you really, I think, are unique, and I value that as we have discussed events in the area for many years. Do you think it is an exaggeration to say that he is really vulnerable? Because after all, he's come through some economic crisis. The country is still there. His polls are dropping, but there is still a significant proportion of the country that does support him. So is this an exaggeration? And also, when you evaluate him, what are the specific factors that you look at to make your determination?
Well, first of all, I don't think he can allow himself to leave office. I mean, this is why, the analogy to the mafia is actually quite appropriate. I mean, it's very difficult for a mafia don to leave because whoever comes afterwards will kill him. And I think this is the fear of dictators everywhere, which is that they cannot leave office, because of what they have done to maintain power. So I don't see him leaving in any way. Moreover, even if you think that it might be a little more civilized, he needs guarantees that he won't have all his assets taken away from him by people who come next. And that's always a worry in these kinds of authoritarian structures. I mean, there is no mechanism for a peaceful transfer of power, since he keeps pushing it off. And now with this referendum, he has pushed it off again, potentially up to 2036. So I don't see much hope for that. I also don't see that he's weak. He still has all of the instruments of power, and as we've seen just in the past 4 weeks in Belarus, even if 80% of the population is against you, well, it hasn't dislodged Lukashenko in the least. So I think that I think the major threat to Putin is precisely the sistema, which does not guarantee that it will be a better system or that it will somehow be sort of different once he is replaced. But, as Churchill talked about Kremlinology, it's trying to observe dogs fighting under a rug. We don't know if there is any dog fighting going on under the rug, but clearly at some point, when he starts slowing down and perhaps making some bigger mistakes or offending someone in his choice of who to bestow with riches and someone getting left out, that there will be some kind of palace revolt. I think that's kind of inevitable, but when that will happen is hard to say. But I do not see any reasonable way for Putin to leave in the near future, as long as he is capable of holding on to the reins of power. And certainly the last thing he would ever want to do, this is to go into contemporary Belarus, is allow any kind of popular revolt in any way threaten his position in power.
Mm. And yet there have been those protests, which are, I think, quite significant. They're happening in cities all over the country for various reasons, but you have to look at some of the ones, especially in Siberia, that have been really kind of against Moscow and quite a bit of criticism of President Putin. Do you think that they are significant? What do they mean?
Well, they have not been treated as significant by Moscow, by the Kremlin. things, I mean, I think we'll have a better handle on this to see what comes out of the local elections this upcoming weekend, in which there are all kinds of shenanigans going on that invariably have accompanied even local elections under the Putin regime. There are shenanigans with registration to vote and so forth, but it'll be very interesting to see what the outcome of the votes are, and also to see what the level of participation is. I recall the last time there were local elections, they tried everything to prevent independent candidates from registering, and even then we're shocked to see how well they did and how well they performed, despite all of the administrative actions taken against them. So I think that it bears following and to look at what the results are in the municipal elections or the local elections. I mean, they vary from republic level down to, I mean, very small town level, but they all are so-called local elections. How much, I mean, that is probably an indicator of some kind of sentiment. On the other hand, I mean, Russia is not a federal state. It is so completely centralized, despite being called a federation, that it probably will have very little effect actually on the way things are run.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to Mr. Khodorkovsky. Mikhail Borisovich, I hope you can hear me. Everything working properly?
No.
Yeah, okay. There are so many things to ask you because you, of everyone, have a very direct relationship, let's put it that way, with President Putin. You were in a labor camp for a while because of the decision by the government. So you have just published a new book. I have not read the entire book. I've read some atrivki, some little portions of it. And I was intrigued by the title, which is Gardarika, which is, I had to remind myself of medieval Russian history, which is an Old Norse term for the states of Kiev and Rus. So we're back there. It's kind of a different type of title, but in it, I did see one quote. You say, one way or another, the regime will end. So what makes you so sure about that?
Я приветствую вас, я благодарю за этот вопрос. Все авторитарные режимы всегда падают. Почему? Ну, потому что вообще все совершают критические ошибки. И авторитарные режимы, и демократические. И при авторитаризме, и при демократии результат критической ошибки – это в конечном итоге смена правительства. Только при демократии это не трагедия, а нормальный ход событий. А при авторитаризме это окончание режима в целом. Почему это произойдет? Почему такая ошибка сейчас становится все более и более вероятной? Весь мир, и Россия в том числе, развиваются сейчас слишком быстро, очень быстро. Опыт 30-летний и даже, я бы сказал, 10-летней давности часто не дает тех преимуществ, которые дают гибкость и креативность 30-летних. Не стоит смотреть на молодых министров путинского правительства. Решения на самом деле принимают, да и проталкивают давние знакомцы, давние друзья, путинское окружение. Им он доверяет, их он понимает. В результате страна уже 6 лет топчется на месте в экономическом развитии. Высококвалифицированная молодежь уезжает. Рейтинг доверия Путину, как уже было сказано, падает. Сам Путин совершает все более и более опасные ошибки. Ну, трудно было представить раньше такое решение, как отравление Навальному, убийство в Англии и Берлине. А ведь эти решения приняты, во всяком случае, при молчаливом одобрении Путина. Потому что силовые структуры – это то, зачем он следит внимательно. Мы понимаем, почему он за этим следит внимательно. Потому что без перехода части силового блока на сторону оппозиции Путин может оставаться у власти еще долго. Но теперь все может произойти и в один день. Потому что он не молодеет, и потому что ситуация в стране перестала быть в результате этого стабильной. Вот после того, как это произойдет, к этому моменту очень важно будет, чтобы по ключевым вопросам сложился общественный консенсус по ключевым вопросам дальнейших реформ. Когда я говорю про консенсус по фундаментальным вопросам, то в моем представлении это означает, что никакая группа в стране, ну, имеется в виду серьезная группа, большая, не готова защищать альтернативную точку зрения крайними методами. Вот для российских условий это означает консенсус. И свой взгляд на важнейшие альтернативы, решения, по которым предстоит принять обществу, я изложил вот как раз в той книжке «Гардарика», о которой вы говорите, и назвал ее так именно по одной из альтернатив. Централизованная, москвоцентричная страна, как сейчас, или Гардарика, страна городов, когда нет одного центра, в который концентрируются все и финансовые, и интеллектуальные силы страны. Я, естественно, выступаю за Гардарику, потому что мы видим, Москва не справляется с теми задачами, которые стоят перед такой огромной страной, как Россия. Москва уже больше Нью-Йорка, но дальше она может превратиться в Буэнос-Айрес, но я не думаю, что это то, что нам бы хотелось. Существуют очень важные ключевые развилки. Одна из них – это сохранять ли пост президента в будущей России с его огромными полномочиями, как фигуру, стоящую над разделением властей. Я лично однозначный сторонник парламентской модели с включением президента в структуру исполнительной ветви власти или превращение этого поста в церемониальный. Сильный президент в такой стране, как Россия, со слабыми институтами достаточно быстро вернет авторитаризм, и мы это видели, к сожалению, уже неоднократно. Еще один ключевой вопрос, который стоит перед нами, перед российским обществом, это куда мы все-таки хотим дальше идти? В сторону империи или в сторону национального, ну или гражданского государства? Я сторонник национального государства. Но тогда у республик в составе России должно быть право на выход. И это вопрос непростой для российского общества, хотя и ключевой. Еще один существенный вопрос, который предстоит решить, это вопрос о сверхдержавии, о так называемом величии России, которое в нашем случае означает участие в куче конфликтов за пределами своей территории. Так вот, сверхдержавие или национальный интерес? Я, конечно, за реальные национальные интересы, но это означает для России отказ от ощущения того, что нас всех боятся. И для многих моих сограждан это очень болезненно. Еще один интересный вопрос, он особенно, я думаю, так сказать, странно, что он стоит, будет для американской аудитории. Это монополия или конкуренция? Ну, для меня и для вас в этом вопроса нет. Тем не менее, наше общество имеет очень разные взгляды на полезность конкуренции в чувствительных сферах. И этот вопрос предстоит решить. Еще одна существенная проблема, по которой, опять же, должен быть выработан такой вот национальный консенсус, это куда мы идем в социальном смысле. В российской политической традиции, если мы идем налево, это означает более социальное государство. Если мы идем направо, это означает то, что в Америке называется консерватизм. Вот для России, на мой взгляд, нет альтернативы возвращения социального государства, пусть и ценой утраты некой динамики экономического развития. У нас, к сожалению, слишком много упущено именно в этой социальной сфере, и мы себе этого позволить не можем. Еще один интересный вопрос, тоже он будет, я думаю, не до конца понятен, может быть, части из аудитории, это переход к правовому государству. Тоже, казалось бы, просто. Но, тем не менее, часть российского общества при воздействии и, естественно, пропаганды отождествляет правовое государство с исполнением законов, навязанных властью. А если мы посмотрим на те законы, которые нам достанутся в наследство вот этого режима, то мы увидим, что огромное количество из них абсолютно неправовые законы. Это даже на английский тяжело перевести. Нормативные акты, не соответствующие праву. И эту проблему нам тоже предстоит решить, что мы хотим как страна. Очень важный вопрос о люстрации. Я сторонник наказывать немногих, тех, кого мы называем первые ученики. Остальным предоставить выбор в рамках широкой амнистии. Конечно, если человек хочет участвовать активно в политической жизни или тем более быть на начальственных должностях в силовых структурах, то он должен быть готов в том, что его прошлое будет просвечено под рентгеном. Но ограничивать в правах 20 миллионов человек, нет, это невозможно. Мое глубокое убеждение, российское общество должно сделать свой выбор о своем собственном будущем. Именно общество его должно будет отстоять в борьбе и быть готовым защищать раз за разом, рискуя жизнью, если надо. Мы видим на примере Белоруссии, что вне силы или вне угрозы применения силы диктаторы не уходят. Если Белоруссия сможет показать, как можно уйти диктаторский режим, потому что здесь возможны варианты, без угрозы силы или без насилия, я буду счастлив. Это будет для меня очень важный урок, образец, который хочется применять. Пока я таких образцов за свою жизнь не видел. В общем, я сформулировал вот эти вот альтернативы, я сформулировал свои ответы. Это, собственно говоря, то, что должны делать политики и общественные деятели, предлагать обществу свое видение и убеждать его в том, что оно правильное. А уж какой ответ даст общество, мы это увидим.
Okay, well, thank you. You obviously, Mikhail Borisovich, have been thinking very deeply about the future and a post-Putin future. And it's very specific. And I think that will be interesting for our participants to follow up with questions about that. I think now, since we're at the halfway point, we will go to questions. And I just want to remind people that if you want to hear the full discussion, again, you have to choose your language, which is down in the bottom right, that globe. Choose your language to make sure that you can hear what you want to hear. And the other thing is asking questions, as has already started in the Q&A function. If you can ask them in English, that would be much easier. So I'm going to start with a question. It's a very specific question. It is for Mr. Khodorkovsky, and it is not theoretical at all. It's very practical. And here it is. We do not see any protests in support of Alexei Navalny. Why? Also, what effect, if any, the protests in Belarus could have on Russia? So, Mikhail Борисович, пожалуйста.
Начну с протестов в Беларуси и протестов в Хабаровске. Это действительно важно для того, чтобы понимать, что на самом деле происходит. Российское общество достаточно инерционно. И те вопросы, которые его реально, практически волнуют, это вопросы, во-первых, социальные. Вот когда в Белоруссии на улицы выходила интеллигенция, я имею в виду образованные люди, журналисты, писатели, так сказать, работники IT-индустрии и так далее, никто этого особо не боялся. Когда забастовали заводы, вот это стало серьезной угрозой, и тогда, собственно говоря, и Путин подключился к решению этой проблемы. Потому что это то, чего он боится. Именно крупные рабочие коллективы, именно левая социальная идея – это то, чего нынешняя власть на самом деле опасается. Алексей Навальный достаточно популярный в России человек, но сопереживание тому, что сделала власть, оно, конечно, присутствует сильно в образованном классе, но гораздо меньше у тех людей, которые реально готовы выйти на улицу и реально сместить власть. А их больше волнуют, как я уже сказал, социальные проблемы. Поэтому этот конфликт только ожидает своего разрешения.
Okay, well, thank you. And in connection with that, there is another question related, and this is for President Ilves. President Ilves, from your point of view, what response should be taken by the United States and the EU regarding the poisoning of Alexei Navalny? And perhaps this question is, what response do you think are likely that we are going to see? Let's start with the first. What should the response be?
Well, I would, since we're unwilling to do more than sanction, then I would just have better sanctions. But I think we need to actually raise the price on these things. It's a difficult issue when it comes because of Western standards of law. But so far, we've only sanctioned individuals who we know about. But this doesn't have much of an effect if their wives and mistresses continue to travel to their mansions in London and their apartments in Trump Tower, and their kids go to school in the West. I think we ought to extend it to families. Then it begins to bite that, yes, you are really isolated now. if you are participating in these kinds of actions. And ultimately, we do know who the major figures are. Do I think they'll do? Oh, and one more thing, of course, I would cancel Nord Stream 2. I mean, if there's ever a reason to do it, given that Germany in any case is in violation of EU rules, just throwing its weight around. But if there's any time to actually cancel Nord Stream 2, this is it. On the second question, what do I think they will do? Little, very little. As we see, too many countries are looking out for an economic advantage. We have seen sort of the reset that proposed by President Macron has now basically fizzed out, but hope springs eternal. And for as long as I've been involved in foreign affairs, I have seen every new person, be it a foreign minister or a president or a prime minister, think they will be the ones who will finally break through and reset relations. It has not happened yet.
There is another question that's kind of related, and I'll put this question to Alina. How effective would a broadly enforced Magnitsky-style act adopted in multiple jurisdictions actually be enforcing the Kremlin's hand? In other words, would seizure of assets in foreign jurisdictions materially expedite the fall of Putin's regime?
I think that's a fantastic question that goes right to the heart of what is the basis of the sistema, the system we've been talking about, which is, of course, organized corruption. The Magnitsky sanctions that were first passed in the United States but have now become the global Magnitsky legislation would go a long way if more countries signed up, because what we see is that various individuals, including very likely Putin himself, hold multiple assets, offshore accounts, not just in one country, but in many countries across the world. We don't know the full extent of those assets and ownership structures, but because for that, we need international cooperation, and we also need a mechanism to then, of course, be able to freeze those assets, as the question suggested, to be able to impose real consequences, personal consequences on specific individuals who steal money directly from the Russian people through embezzlement, and then park them in real estate investments in London, in the United States, elsewhere across the world, in Spain, where have you. And basically, we have allowed our financial systems to become a tool of kleptocracy. And it should be the opposite of that. It should be a tool for transparency and for our ability to curb corruption and the ability of the Kremlin elite and of the system to maintain itself. So certainly if more and more countries sign up to what now is the global Magnitsky initiative, they will go a long way in, I think, curbing some of these global kleptocratic networks and chains that support the regime in Moscow.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here. I think the best person to answer would be Mikhail Borisovich. And Mikhail Borisovich, this is I'd say, kind of a longer term question. And it's about the prospects for the Russian economy and prospects for the transition away from fossil fuels like oil and gas, and then also the economic downturn that let's leave that off. I'm just going to ask you, because you know the oil and gas industry very well. Can Russia eventually turn away from that, from oil and gas, all of these natural resources? And would that lead to an economic downturn? Why doesn't Putin do it anyway, I would ask? He talks about an internet economy and, you know, sophistication in the digital world. Why doesn't he do that? Mikhail Borisovich?
Да. Россия, конечно, может, как и любая другая страна, отойти от углеводородного топлива, снизив свое потребление энергии приблизительно в 5 раз, или заменив производство значительной части энергии на атомную энергию. Других возможностей в сегодняшнем мире у крупных стран попросту нет. Если кто-нибудь мне не верит, пускай энергетический баланс посмотрит. То, что стоит сделать с точки зрения экологической ситуации, это, конечно, постепенно заменять уголь на газ, и я надеюсь, что этот процесс будет происходить. России просто нет смысла заменять возможности использования газа на что-нибудь другое на ближайшие, я не знаю, 50, возможно, лет. Вопрос другой. Какая часть российской экономики базируется на производстве углеводородного сырья? И вот здесь давайте не ошибаться в отношении нынешней ситуации. Доля энергетики в России не такая уж большая. Доля продаж углеводородного сырья на Запад в валовом внутреннем продукте России, я не знаю, может быть 10%. То есть это приличная добавка, но это не критично. Вот где это критично, это то, что в федеральном бюджете рентные доходы составляют 50 и более процентов. И именно они позволяют Путину делать вид, только делать вид, естественно, что именно он является благодетелем, который раздает деньги обществу. Сейчас в связи с падением цен на нефть и газ и с сокращением Европой приема российского газа, эти возможности у него упали. И это по-настоящему болезненно. Может ли Путин развить современные отрасли промышленности? Очень много российских экономистов, особенно в том числе таких, как Кудрин, много раз пытались придумать такие бы реформы, которые можно было бы осуществить без политических изменений. На сегодняшний день в российском обществе существует консенсус на эту тему. Без смены нынешнего режима это попросту невозможно, потому что нужны люди, нужно доверие и коммуникация с развитыми странами. Ни того, ни другого при этом режиме уже не будет никогда.
Here's a question, and I think it's an interesting one. It's on the protests, getting back to something that I've been keeping my eye on, and I think really are significant on many levels. And President Ilves, President Ilves, could I ask you this question? So the Kremlin has been careful thus far not to go overboard in suppressing protests, especially, let's say, in Khabarovsk. This seems to affirm their belief that any confrontation with the police could spur further pushback. How do you see the prospects for further discontent if Moscow just lets the protests fizzle out?
Well, of course, Moscow does have the winter on its side, so that it's much harder to protest in the cold than when it's warm outside. Well, I've been surprised that they've actually let the Khabarovsk thing go on, and presumably not having anything come out of it really has dissipated the ardor with which people were protesting. Maybe that's the tactic they will take. Of course, as soon as it becomes a genuine threat, it will be suppressed. This is the greatest fear of Putin. Why he is obsessed with so-called color revolutions all along not only the perimeter of Russia, but also even elsewhere, is that popular protest is something that he cannot stand, will not abide by, and soon as it becomes big enough to actually be some kind of threat of the kind of, with the kind of massive outpouring we've seen in Belarus, it will be stifled.
Alina, I want to ask you a question. You and I actually have discussed this in terms of young people in Russia, let's say dissent among young people, and just kind of disaffection by young Russians, that a number of people are leaving. The figures vary, but there is a significant number of people, of Russians, who are simply saying goodbye to Russia, moving to other countries. And so the question here is, unlike the USSR, the borders are open and many people who can do leave. So what if there aren't enough people left for, which probably is an exaggeration, but either a peaceful or bloody revolution? How long can the Putin system sustain itself? Obviously, I think that is an exaggeration, but what is the influence of the numbers of people who are leaving Russia?
Well, thank you, Jill, for the question. And this was also something that Mikhail Borisovich mentioned in his opening comments. The brain drain from Russia has only accelerated in the later years of Putin. If we even look at some Russian official numbers, which you always have to take with a grain of salt, we see an acceleration of this brain drain, basically starting around 2012 and continuing onward. What we know about these people is that they are the Russians that should be staying to build a Russian future for their society. They're often those who have technical skills so they can take elsewhere or more money elsewhere. They usually speak other languages because they move to other countries and acquire jobs there. We don't know a huge amount about them except for some anecdotal reporting. But I think what it clearly points to is that the very people who should be building a Russia that is successful, that is economically vibrant, that takes advantage of its incredible human capital resources. You know, there's the greatest irony with Russia has always been that so many Nobel laureates, known scientists tend to come from that country, yet the country itself cannot take advantage because of this system of corruption, this authoritarian autocratic regime that's been established. It cannot actually take advantage of the incredibly rich resources that it has. And so the question, if all these people are leaving, you know, what is left behind? You know, and I think to me, that is the key question that we should be asking ourselves. And I think the people who are left behind tend to be those who, you know, are dependent on the state for employment. The Russian state it has grown to employ a huge number of people. The individuals don't have the resources to immigrate. Or there are those who believe and truly support, people of course support Putin and this nationalist agenda that the Russian state media and the Kremlin has been trying to propagate. Many people do support them. They don't want to leave, of course. I don't want to imply that everyone in Russia wants to leave. Of course, it's not the case. I think Russians tend to love their country like many other citizens of the world tend to love their countries. But I think, you know, the demographic question is a serious one, because not only do you have the out-migration, but of course you've had declining fertility rates for more than one generation in Russia now. And so if we look at Russia's future as the largest country in the world, but it is sparsely populated and the people who remain are not necessarily often those who have the kinds of human capital skills to be able to develop Russia's economic sectors. My hope is that they would stay, but of course they don't have the opportunities to be able to develop themselves, to have not just political freedoms. A lot of these people I don't think are very political. And I think Mikhail Borisovich through Open Russia has done a huge amount of work trying to understand who these people are. And I'm really curious to hear from him on that. But that has been my kind of anecdotal experience so far. And I think it spells grim stagnation for Russia's future, because they're losing the people who could build Russia into a prosperous society that it deserves to be.
Mikhail Borisovich, then I have to follow up. Alina is asking you, who are these people who are leaving? And then also I would ask one question that came up that's quite interesting about these protests. It's kind of linked. What about the growing evidence of linkage, connection between the protests across the country? So 2 questions for you.
Как вы прекрасно понимаете, уезжают наиболее активные, наиболее подвижные люди, те люди, которые считают, что они могут добиться успеха за границей.
Mikhail Borisovich, извините, пожалуйста.
Вы можете обратить внимание, что те рабочие места.
Can everybody hear the translation?
Да-да.
Okay, I cannot, but okay. I lost my. Извините, пожалуйста, я потеряла связь. Продолжайте, пожалуйста.
Не слышу.
Mikhail Borisovich, I think you can continue.
Уезжают, как вы прекрасно понимаете, наиболее активные, наиболее подвижные люди, наиболее квалифицированные. Вы можете заметить, что выходцы из России в большинстве занимают в других странах позиции квалифицированные, высококвалифицированные рабочие места. И это очень важно, потому что это показывает, с одной стороны, что российские граждане высоко адаптивные, ничем не отличаются от тех людей, которые живут на Западе. И, в общем, хотя это иногда вызывает на Западе сомнения, а с другой стороны, это означает, что Россия теряет во многом свой золотой фонд. Я могу привести пример. У меня один мой знакомый занимался в России запуском космических аппаратов, молодой парень, до тех пор, пока к нему не пришли из ФСБ и не начали историю, которая могла закончиться для него обвинением в шпионаже. Сейчас он занимается тем же самым, занимается спутниками, но компания его существует в Кремниевой долине. Это не единственная история, к моему глубокому сожалению для страны, для моего знакомого, это, конечно, история с хорошим концом. Вот вторую половину вопроса я не до конца понял. Что значит про протестные?
Yes, among the protests that are taking place across Russia, there appears to be a connection. Perhaps that's not correct, but there have been reports that there is some type of connection.
Есть некая коммуникация, но вот это вот очень интересно. Она именно сетевая. Вот сейчас наши ребята из открытки были и в Хабаровске, и в Минске. К слову, в Минске некоторых из них я потом с трудом выдернул из тамошней тюрьмы. Так вот, в Хабаровске они сказали, что мы пытались найти тех людей, которые организуют протест. Нет таких людей. Вот он происходит случайным образом в сети. То же самое в значительной степени происходит в Минске. Были протесты в Башкирии. То же самое, приехали люди из разных регионов, которые и помогали протестующим, и, соответственно, знакомились с тем опытом, который там происходит. То есть взаимодействие происходит не через единый координирующий центр, который так ищет ФСБ, желающий этот центр найти и куда-нибудь посадить. А взаимодействие происходит на уровне сетевых структур, и, конечно, там тоже можно всех пересажать, но это будут уже тысячи, если не десятки тысяч людей.
Okay. Well, thank you. I once again lost my connection, which was very exciting. I was gone for a few seconds and almost had a heart attack, but I am back and very glad to say that I am. And actually, we're very close to the top of the hour. Alina, I know you said that we could go for like 5 more minutes, which would be 8 more minutes. Is it possible, very, very briefly, for our participants just to kind of wrap it up, and really briefly, because I think this has been a fascinating discussion, both short-term and long-term. So President Ilves, let's start with you. Your conclusions, заключение, and then we will go to Mikhail Borisovich, and then finally Alina.
I would say, I mean, for the overall question, will he survive, or how long will he stay? I mean, I think that if there is to be a democratic government to follow what the Putin regime, Putin still has to then, if he's alive, obviously, worry about things such as being sent to The Hague for all of his for his war crimes. I mean, for annexation of Crimea, for Donbass, for Georgia, and not to mention then all of his domestic activity. So I think that, I mean, he is really a prisoner of his position, and so he might as well stay on as the head of the mafia mob than give it up. But he will leave only if Russia remains has an undemocratic regime, because if it's a democratic regime, he has to face the consequences of his actions of the past 20 years.
And Mikhail Borisovich, I know that you've said a lot, and it's very broad and actually very deep. But if there is one, as we say in English, takeaway, what should our audience take?
Чисто по-человечески я хотел бы, чтобы Путин дожил и до 2024 года, и дальше, но только не на своем посту. Вот. Это у него прекрасные дочери, я надеюсь, что, так сказать, будут там такие же прекрасные внуки и внучки. Вот пускай ими занимается. Я не знаю, что решит суд в отношении его прегрешений, но я все-таки сторонник того, чтобы делать ставку на мирное разрешение конфликта, а мирное разрешение конфликта предусматривает все-таки некоторый иммунитет для его участников. Если же мирного разрешения конфликта не будет, то я боюсь, что, как сказал уже уважаемый президент Илор, мы будем иметь дело с жесткими последствиями для Путина и для всего его окружения. Ну а нам предстоит заниматься, сейчас уже готовиться к тому, что будет после Путина, потому что это все равно вопрос ограниченного количества лет. Вот мне 57, и я не скажу, что даже 20 лет – это много. Хотя я не верю, что еще 20 лет это может продлиться.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Alina Polyakova, can you wrap up how would you sum this up?
Well, thank you, Jill. I think I would just add from a more of a policy perspective, a point of emphasis, which is that when we talk about how do we deal with quote unquote Russia, a Russia that is more aggressive, that has invaded countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, that has obviously been caught red-handed in many covert operations, poisonings, interference in our own elections in the United States and elsewhere. I think we can't forget that what we're really talking about is the Kremlin and the regime, and that if you speak to, I think anyone, I think Jill, being such a Russia expert yourself, I know you must feel the same way, that at the end of the day, what we want to achieve is the ability for the Russian people to choose their own path, the ability for them to have a future in which they have choices, political choices, of course, but choices about their economic futures as well. And those are the universal values of freedom of choice, of freedom to allow your children to have a better life than you. Those are things that I think everyone wants, no matter where we live. And I think our policies have to reflect that. So when we're talking about things like the global Magnitsky sanctions, I think those are incredibly powerful because they're targeted against specific individuals, the individuals who are producing a society in Russia that is not serving the Russian people. I think we have to keep that very much in mind when we're talking about this new era of great power competition, which has become a very common trope here in Washington, D.C., where I'm coming from today. I would just say that it's been such an honor to speak with you, Jill, and with you, Mikhail Borisovich, and with you, President Ilves. We need to have more of these kinds of long-term conversations to be more creative and thinking about what the future holds, rather than focusing on the specifics of today, which are, of course, overwhelming and important. But I think that my big question for Russia is what happens now to prepare Russian society for the inevitability of change. I think change is inevitable. It may not happen in 5 years, we don't know, but it'll probably happen in the next 20 years. And a society that is mentally, politically prepared for that is really important, and we have to invest into that today. And so with that, I'll just close and on behalf of SIPA, thank all of you for this really thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you very much, Alina. And thank you to our interpreter, Yelena Cook, who was very good and very patient. Thank you to Mikhail Borisovich. Thank you to President Ilves. And thank you again, Alina. And thank you to our audience who gave some very good questions to us. I hope you'll come back. There will be many other events that SIPA will be having. And they're always on a very high level and I think very intellectually challenging. So thank you. Spasibo большое to everybody. And bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.